What is up everybody, it is me DevilNeverCry, and in this video I'll be going over which Devil May Cry game I think is truly the hardest. As always, make sure you subscribe to stay up to date with anything and everything DMC, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out when new content drops. So diving into the topic of today's video, we'll be going through DMC 1 through 5, discounting the reboot entirely because it's, well, the reboot. And I'll be kind of laying out what I think is the hardest game and why. For added context, I should mention I have platinumed the entire series, I've played them all to completion, I've platinumed the HD collection twice, including DMC 2, because I hate myself just that much. So it's safe to assume that I know what I'm talking about when it comes to the difficulty of these games. Speaking of difficulties, let's just go through them right now. So the games tend to have 4 conventional difficulties with some added extra difficulties which we're going to get onto in a second, but starting off with easy mode, obviously known as human mode in some of the later releases or the later games. Then you've got normal mode, aka Devil Hunter mode, hard mode, which is also known as Son of Sparda mode, and then you've also got Dante Must Die mode, which is said to be the hardest difficulty or the very hard difficulty. And I know some of you are already in the comments typing, well, what about a very hard mode? That mode was only exclusive to DMC 3, it's not in any of the other games, so I can't really compare it like for like. And what about Hell and Hell, or Heaven and Hell? And, you know, again, I can't necessarily compare them between all the games because they're not included in all the games, but not only that, they are not the hardest difficulties. Whilst they've got added stipulations that might make them more challenging, the actual in-game difficulty is only set to Son of Sparda or hard mode, so the game isn't as difficult as it could be. And so naturally that leads us to a comparison between each game's DMD mode or Dante Must Die mode. So what exactly makes this difficulty so much harder than the rest? Well, there's a few obvious points that I want to touch upon, such as the enemy AI, the aggressiveness is ramped up, the enemies are a lot speedier, they'll chase you down, you'll essentially have a lot less breathing room in an encounter, forcing you to think on your feet, otherwise you're kinda screwed. Another obvious change in this mode is the fact that enemies will put out a lot more damage and they'll take a lot more punishment themselves, forcing you to attack them for far longer, meaning that you're more likely to make mistakes as you stay in that sweet spot or that pocket to do damage. And the biggest change of them all, which many of you most likely know, is the Devil Trigger mechanic. Now if you've played the games on the standard difficulties and haven't touched Dante Must Die, you'll likely think that the Devil Trigger mechanic is exclusive to the playable characters. Well, DMD flips this on its head where enemies have access to their own Devil Trigger. There is, however, a difference between the playable character's DT or Devil Trigger and the enemy's DT, where an enemy Devil Triggers will allow the enemies to max out their damage output and their vitality or their defense, and they also gain access to hyper armor, which means that you'll be able to hit them but they'll just trade hits and they'll just mash you down and you'll probably end up dead before you know it. But the main difference is that enemies will not regenerate their health unless we are talking about a specific boss. Cough cough, hint hint, Virgil, obviously, everybody's favourite character. But the Devil Trigger mechanic works differently depending on which game you play. In the original Devil May Cry, there was a timer that would sometimes appear during specific encounters where you'd have a set amount of time to kill enemies before everything in the room pops its Devil Trigger all at once. I found this mode to be quite fair in this game. As long as you're good enough, you're able to defeat all the enemies before the timer counts down. You can get through an encounter trouble-free. It also added a little bit of anxiety seeing that counter just tick down, knowing that if you fail to destroy everything, everything will pop its Devil Trigger and things will get much, much harder. Especially considering that every time a timer popped up in the original Devil May Cry, it meant that that encounter was mandatory and the room was sealed, meaning you couldn't just run away. Moving on to Devil May Cry 2, unfortunately. The enemies and the bosses all had their own Devil Trigger, but there wasn't really much to remember, despite me putting in more hours than I should have. Of course the enemies did have their own Devil Trigger, but it seemed to just pop whenever during an encounter. There wasn't a timer or minimum amount of enemies killed or anything like that. Devil May Cry 3 is where things began to get a little bit more interesting and a lot more aggravating when it came to Dante Must Die mode and enemies Devil Triggering. So DMC 3 kind of took after the original game, where there was a timer whenever you got into an encounter. However, in this game, the timer is invisible, so if you managed to not kill all the enemies in an encounter before this invisible timer ran out, they all automatically popped their devil trigger. Or if you killed 3 enemies before the timer runs out, then everybody else that's left in the encounter pops their devil trigger. This allows for a little bit of strategy, as you can probably pick the hardest enemies to fight, and if you kill them first, it means you don't have to fight them with their devil trigger, and that is something you definitely do not want to do in this game, because the enemies had their defense and their health buffed 300 goddamn %. That's right, I did not misspeak there. 300%. In the previous games, the enemy's defense and health was boosted by a modest 200% roughly, sometimes as low as 90 or 100% in the original Devil May Cry. But in DMC 3 they just decided to throw caution to the wind and just be like, well, I guess we're here to fuck the player entirely, so let's have at it. I guess the development team in Capcom took the player feedback and salt to heart, because for Devil May Cry 4, Dante Must Die mode was kinda nerfed, to be honest, a considerable amount. Rather boring, and probably the easiest Dante Must Die mode to clear out of the entire series. Taking a look at some of the figures, it looks as though the players did a 30% decrease in damage to enemies, so they got a 30% defense buff, I guess you could say in another way. But the enemies did roughly 300% extra damage to the player, so if you got hit, you really got hit. But overall, the enemies kind of went down fairly easily as long as you knew what you were doing. Again, you still had to play and pay attention, but you could kind of go on autopilot once you knew the game enough. And that brings us on to the latest entry in the stylish action series, which is Devil May Cry 5. Now, the Dante Must Die mode in this game wasn't necessarily all too hard. However, there were a few enemies that were essentially taking the piss, if I'm being rather honest. Enemies like the Proto-Angelo and the Behemoth took a stupendous amount of damage to down, and they did a ridiculous amount of damage back, especially if you got clipped by a stray attack that you probably should have dodged. If any of you tuned into my Platinum Run DMC 5 streams, you'll know just how aggravated I got at a few of these enemies in this difficulty, but in all honesty, with the movement options you have in this game and the overpowered moves that Dante and Nero have at their disposal, DMD mode in this game wasn't necessarily all too bad. It was a touch harder than DMC 4, but overall it wasn't all too bad. Which kind of brings me onto the topic of this video, and which game I think is the hardest to beat on Dante Must Die mode. And at this point, some of you can probably already guess, but it is the original Devil May Cry. And let me list out a few reasons why I think this is the hardest to beat on the Dante Must Die difficulty. The original Devil May Cry is different to its sequels in that there is no mission select feature whatsoever. You are stuck on whatever mission you're stuck on. It means you can't go back to a previous mission and farm orbs. Not that there's much of a point in farming, because you can't just item spam your way through. Essentially in this game, you are capped on the amount of items you can buy per playthrough, especially on Dante Must Die, where you can't necessarily buy all too much and the orb requirement to buy items just keeps ramping up exponentially. You can't just cheese your way through. You're capped on the Devil Stars you can buy, the Untouchables you can buy, the Holy Waters you can buy, and on any of the difficulties, you can only carry one Vital Star on your person at a single time. That means that once you're stuck on a mission or a boss, good luck, because there is no cheesing it. You're going to have to learn, or you're not going to get through it. There is, however, one single discrepancy to this rule, one exception, so to speak, and that is that you can break through the hard item cap by doing multiple playthroughs, one after the other, over and over. If you want to try and carry your way through DMD with items, you'll probably be looking at maybe 10 plus runs on normal mode, just picking up where every single item is, and you're going to have to know where every single item is to be effective at this. But even then, success is not guaranteed on Dante Must Die, because the effect that certain items have is negligible. Not only that, but some items outright just do not work. For example, on the final boss, good luck getting his health down with Holy Waters, because he just literally shrugs it off. And yes, while some of the encounters might be easy, especially with that timer mechanic, the bosses are where the difficulty is truly at. They literally are make or break moments. Couple the fact that you can't item spam along with the limited mobility. There is no sword trick in here. There is no trickster dash. There's no royal guard. You have to know the bosses or you're never going to get past them, so to speak. And I know some of you might be saying, well, what about DMC 3? The enemies have ridiculous damage, ridiculous vitality. Simply put, the fact that you can just buy your way through, you can just farm previous missions over and over on lower difficulties, and then just buy all the items you need, it kind of negates all the difficulty altogether. If you wanted to, you could item spam your way through, even through Virgil 3 or the terribly fated, disgusting boss Arkham. It can all be just alleviated with item spam. Not only that, but Dante's got a wide variety of moves. You know, he's got Trickster, he's got Royal Guard. If you don't want to item spam, you've got all these tools at your disposal to, you know, get you out of harm's way. And the same honestly just goes for DMC 5 and DMC 4, which DMC 4 is probably the easiest to beat on Dante Must Die. And yeah, I'm not really talking about DMC 2 because in all honesty, playing that game on any difficulty wants to make you brick your console or take a hammer to your PC because it's just that bad. And well, there you have it, people. That is my own personal ranking for the DMC games in terms of how hard I think they are. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you guys agree? Do you disagree? Do you find some games harder than others? If you haven't tried these games on Dante Must Die mode, I highly suggest you do. They are a test, a fun test at that. But I'm going to round the video off there, folks. If you enjoyed today's video, do be sure to leave a like. There'll be links in the description to some of my social and stuff. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and Twitch. And with all of that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I would like to thank all of you for watching. And as always, I'll see you all next video.